Hello and welcome to Bottom Line. I'm Cindy Kainz. We have a great show for you today. We're going to talk about a topic that hopefully can help everybody, and it's giving and receiving feedback. I'd like to welcome my guest for today's show. She has started her own consulting company to help all of us understand this topic better. Priti Shah, welcome to Bottom Line.
Thank you, Cindy. Happy to be here.
So, giving and receiving feedback. It's always a difficult sometimes thing to do, whether maybe in the professional life or personal life. But I think one area you like to always start on is possibly looking at receiving feedback. But before we do that, what made you get into wanting to help people in this particular area of giving and receiving feedback?
That's a great question. It comes from just my upbringing. I had a very difficult time just going through normal everyday situations that maybe a lot of people don't realize it can be a struggle otherwise. Growing up with language and cultural barriers that, a lot of people just don't realize it's just everyday situations. But I really struggled, not just, in my school environments, but other personal environments, and also in my professional environment, starting with my first professional employer, Walt Disney World. And so I decided to start studying and really looking at different ways of handling situations and the information coming at me, starting with that experience, especially. And I really grew in my journey through my career and really put into place how my learnings and teachings have transpired and see how effective they are by conducting a behavioral study that I did while I was working at General Motors. And that study was found to be effective. And now I've delivered that seminar to several organizations, benefiting a variety of audiences. And I'm just seeing where that goes from here. And the consulting organization that started not just helps on feedback, but really all interpersonal development areas, leadership development, although I help with everything, but my expertise, my specialty is developing methodologies that help people step out of the stream and find their own right path.
Right. Oh, amazing. And so let's delve into this and let's talk about receiving feedback. I know you say there's 4 parts, and the first one is to acknowledge the gift. What happens when someone feels that it doesn't feel like a gift?
And that's actually another good point, because a lot of us go through the world, go through our daily lives. Like, if you really think about it, it's incredible how much stuff is feedback every single day and every moment. When you really think about it, it's pretty incredible how much stuff is actually feedback. It's also unfortunate that there's a lot of information that comes through all of society to each of us individually, and we disregard it or don't really process it because we're not equipped to be approachable and acknowledge the feedback. And I think that we'd transform as a society in a really positive way if society was even more equipped to handle valuable information coming at us and instead of just disregarding it. That comes into our workplace with the feedback that's given, not just in formal settings and at times of performance reviews, but otherwise as well, and other informal environments as well. And we just don't realize how much value there is to the information given at us, and anything that we've learned to do, whether it's to walk, talk, write, become successful in our career, anything is with the help of some sort of feedback. And by taking that first step to acknowledge the information coming at you, that, hey, I recognize that I'm hearing what you're saying, I'm here to listen to what you have to say, that's the very first step to acknowledging that there's valuable information coming at you that you might want to hear.
Right. And, Prita, question I have as I think about that, acknowledging the gift. And, a lot of times, and when I was saying earlier, maybe it doesn't seem like a gift because it might be depending on who's providing the feedback to you. How do you go about, okay, if someone acknowledges and provides that, okay, maybe you need to be open to it, which is your second step. and kind of investigate why they're saying this to you. But how, is there any tips if someone's giving you feedback from someone you might not feel should be? Is there something to help you go from step one to step two to say, okay, I may not think, the person giving this is the right one to tell me, but there might be something in there that's valuable?
That's another important question, actually. No, I think a lot of people struggle with this and have a hard time with this because we become automatic with our responses, and then we forget that there's another way to operate to be able to really understand what the information at us is what it means. So what I always say, that feedback may not always be credible. Sometimes we feel that it's faulty or subjective or based on inaccurate information, or that the advice will do us more harm than good. Feedback may not be constructive or diplomatic at times. However, with the right tools, we can empower ourselves to receive this type of information and be more inclusive of others' perceptions of ourselves. And the way that I talk about this in my full seminar is that I discuss some important humanistic principles. It's not the end all be all of all the humanistic principles out there, but it's a start to the conversation and how we can use humanistic principles such as the applicability of nonviolence, our passions, looking at different perspectives, self-acceptance, to help us investigate what the value is of the information coming at us, which is the second step that you're referring to overcome our own internal barriers that prevent us from actually investigating and going past our fear of understanding what the information is that's actually being given to you.
So if we look at, acknowledging it, opening and investigating what the person is saying to us, I know your third step is kind of confirming it and maybe accepting that there's value in it. How can someone do that? Because what happens, sometimes someone give you feedback and sometimes it can be some give and take. So is there some questions? Is there some things that I could ask the other person to make sure I can understand and the value of it? Because maybe the words didn't come across or not. So are there some tips or techniques on how to, say, okay, I hear what you're saying, but this or that?
Yeah, and then actually that's a great start right there. I think you're saying, is this what you're saying? Just asking to confirm in a way of curiosity and learning, not from like prejudgment. Because a lot of times when we summarize information, sometimes it comes off kind of jaded. A lot of times we can become jaded or like, I don't want to deal with that again. I don't need to deal with that person. And I understood what they said, and don't want to deal with it again.
Who are you to tell me?
Right. Exactly. But instead, I really challenge people to really, instead of becoming jaded by it, to really try to utilize it for our growth and well-being. And something else that I say in my talk that I'm featured as a TEDx speaker, I say that the things that bring you hardship are the very same things that propel us to success. And it's not because we become jaded by those hard situations. It's actually because we utilize them to understand how they can actually help us with our growth. And some of the examples that you gave, what I think you're saying are very, very great ways of trying to establish or trying to understand what that person is saying. And the key thing is in that process is to not become defensive, not trying to explain yourself until you really understood where that person's coming from. So that way they can feel heard and become less defensive on their end, because two wrongs don't make a right. If both people are, at it and trying to be defensive, it really doesn't open up any approachability on either end. So the best thing that we can do is really build our own personal brand. If your goal hopefully is to be more approachable and not someone like, I can't talk to that person about that topic, they just won't hear it, they just won't want to listen. And so instead, if you want to be that person that someone is wanting to approach you and someone that is a leader really, then we want to try to help, not make two wrongs make a right, but actually be the right and trying to understand where that person's coming from and really help close that loop in building that partnership and collaboration with the other person.
Right. And if we're looking at, receiving feedback, somebody is giving it to us, right? And we're receiving it. What is the person, and it's hard not to talk about giving side of things, when we're talking about receiving, because it makes me think, what is the purpose of giving someone feedback? Is it more like me saying, hey, I'm going to tell you what you did wrong, or is it something that, do you find that a lot of people are doing it maybe for their own self reasons, or are they really doing it because they want to help benefit the person they're telling or sharing the feedback with?
And that is a very personal question, and not in terms of like myself, but just individually. Like everyone's motive is a little bit different, and on why they speak up. Every time we say a word, every time we choose to speak up in any situation, whether it's verbally or non-verbally, we really want to ask ourselves: is this because it's helping me, or is it because it's helping someone else? And a lot of times, and some people will tell me that in workplace situations, oh, I can handle workplace feedback because it's more professional, it's more diplomatic. However, like you said, like even at the workplace, people watch out for themselves a lot because of the way the society is. The workplace is a very it's a survival need. The outcome of your work, it provides food on the table, like provides the income required to put food on the table, put a roof above your head. And so sometimes the information coming at us at the workplace is political, becomes political, especially because there's not just because it's a survival need, but also because there's rules and regulations on how things can be said, how they should be said, and how it should be delivered. And so a lot of times people don't have a way or feel comfortable to be as transparent as maybe people do in the personal environment. And so, as people say that it's easier to receive feedback in the workplace, a lot of times it's actually harder because we don't actually understand what's going on. It can make situations really cloudy, so that when you mention giving feedback, sometimes it's harder to actually stand up for yourself and advocate for yourself in a professional environment, just because it's not so straightforward. And sometimes situations are really cloudy, and so we don't really understand how to even advocate for ourselves.
Right. And one thing as I think about with receiving feedback and giving, and maybe to talk just and kind of close out a little bit here more on the receiving end of it, if you're receiving feedback, and whether you are a fan of the person who's providing it or not, and the way that they gave you the feedback, you find offensive or not, or disappointing, or it wasn't in a very good way of providing it, should that person turn around and say to the other person giving it that, it might have been better if you said it like this, or, so that somebody doesn't leave that conversation being more upset or bothered by the feedback?
That I'm going to answer in two parts. So
Okay.
One would be the process of the person receiving them offensive information, and the second way I'm going to answer it is what that person should do to give feedback to that offensive person. So the first part of it, the receiving part of it. So people will not, like you mentioned, people will not say things the way that you want to hear them. Even when people have the best of intentions, like I think I think I nailed that. I was really sensitive to what they need, and I thought I did the best job when I delivered that information. But sometimes, it still can be said wrong. Someone will always somehow take it offensively, especially when we're in a society where people are used to. And this is also cultural based, because I will argue the Asian culture is actually different than this, but receiving positive information. And so if we're given even one little negative information, we'll just disregard everything else that was said. And wow, that was said the worst way. They really, told me that I needed to clean up my desk, when they disregard everything else, And so, but, even if something is like, maybe majority would say that is said offensively, like, oh, you're an awful person, or, you, I don't know, whatever that could traditionally be seen as offensive. I think that still, I would still argue that the person receiving it needs, to their best ability, receive the information, because, and I know this is contrary to maybe popular belief, but I really feel that we focus too much on what the actual words of what's being said is, like the details of the words they use, like if it seems really offensive, instead of looking at the picture and situation more holistically. Because whatever that person said triggered an emotional response within you to take that information offensively. In the same respect, that person, it's something that you did or said evoked an emotional response in that person to say something that was offensive. And so, even if what they're saying in detailed respect, because you're like, may not necessarily help you improve, it could help you build a better relationship with that person by understanding why that emotion was evoked, by what you did evoke that negative emotion on the other person. So it helps you empathize with the pain and suffering that was caused. It helps you gain perspective on what you do and say and how that impacts the people around you, so that we can improve our relationships with the people around us and empathize the pain and suffering that they also feel that even caused them to say something in the first place. And then as far as the second part of it, should they say something in response to how that was said? I would say yes, but it sounds like the other person needs to feel understood first before they're open and approachable to what you have to say to correct their behavior. Because it sounds like, a lot of times it sounds like that that initial response was because they were dealing with some type of pain and suffering that caused them to react in that way. And by us empathizing with their pain, they can start then empathizing with your pain on how they reacted to whatever you did, if that makes sense.
Yes. Yes, it does. And so what I'd like to do now is talk a little bit about the giving part, giving it. Now, with that in mind, though, we all know what we've just talked about for receiving. And we know we don't like to receive, feedback that seems maybe, overly personal or attacking or anything. But now if we turn it around and we're the person giving and we know what it's like when we don't like to receive it a certain way, how do we now do better to give information so that, we're giving it and also maybe setting an example for someone else to see how giving it could be actually beneficial?
That's a great topic. And it's also an important topic. And like I was mentioning before, actually not, when we were talking before we got on air, I was mentioning how there's so much focus on giving feedback over receiving feedback a lot of times in the workplace. In my experience in my work and in my work and studying how people receive feedback. But I still, sorry. So just to finish that thought, so I do stand by that. In order to give effective feedback, the first step is to receive feedback effectively. Because unless you understand why and how the information coming at you is even there, and then also becoming aware of ourselves, our own internal barriers, on why and how we're receiving the information coming at us, then we are then better prepared on giving feedback. And so now going into giving feedback, when we've gained that awareness, and it's not like you have to know everything about why I think something is happening and about ourselves before you can give feedback. I'm just saying that really helps people in their process of giving feedback. But everything's a give and take, and everything's a learning and trial and error journey, which also comes into play in giving feedback. And the best advice that I can give to people, and I do have an hour seminar that I give on this topic, just as I do on the topic of receiving feedback. But in terms of giving feedback, the first thing that I ask people is to establish what they stand for, and really understand what their value system is, and understand what their needs and wants are, and what their priority needs are. Because there's two ways that people give feedback. It's either that they're speaking up for themselves, like I mentioned before, or they're speaking up for other people. And if they are speaking up for other people, I still encourage people to still identify what their needs are and what their boundaries are. And just to summarize this just one last sentence, is that if you've ever traveled into an airplane, I'm sure all of us have traveled in an airplane at some point in our life. And one of the first safety things that they say in the airplane, I know this is kind of cliche, is, please secure your own mask before helping others, including children. So what that means to me is, how are you going to help other people if you can't help yourself? And to me, feedback is very similar. It's like, even if you are speaking up for someone else, which I think is a good thing, it's a very noble thing to be in a collaborative and supportive community. But I think that we can only be in that place of collaboration and support when we can first take care of ourselves.
Right. So if we're looking at getting prepared to give someone, feedback, and of course, let's say we've been working really hard to, accept the feedback, accept the gift, understand the value, use it if applicable, but now we have to give feedback to somebody. And let's say maybe it needs to be constructive. Before we do that, are there some steps that you might recommend? Maybe writing something down or thinking about the words we use, because sometimes, and I know sometimes feedback can be very quick, back and forth, and you don't have that kind of time to prepare. But if it's a serious feedback and you really want to share it with somebody, what are those maybe tips or techniques on preparing to give good feedback?
So there is a step-by-step process on how to give feedback. But the very first thing, the most simple thing that I recommend people to do is to first, there's 4 types of communication. There's passive communication, aggressive communication, passive-aggressive communication, and assertive communication. And there's different boundary implications when people communicate in those different ways of operating. And the healthiest of those 4 options is assertive communication. So no matter how the information is coming at you, whether it's respecting your boundaries or not, I encourage all people to use assertive communication in responding back. And
when you use the word assertive, I have a feeling you don't mean aggressive.
Correct. So it's using clear I statements, like, right. I feel blank when you blank. I would appreciate if you blank. So when you use an I statement, that's a very, very powerful way, and one of many ways of addressing someone with assertive communication, because it really, it's not like a perspective, like, I heard you say this, I heard them say that. It's being very clear. This is what my need is. And this is not being accomplished because of, it's being impacted because of this happening by your actions. And so I would appreciate this other thing. So it's being very clear on what you need, how you're being impacted on your need, and why you're telling that person because of what they're doing, and what the correction is. And I think a lot of times the problem with giving feedback comes into play is that people focus too much on the symptoms, like, I'm angry or I'm frustrated. And I'm not saying that's not important. It's very important to be aware of where the problem is coming from and like how you feel about it. But the problem, I think, that the thing that would really close the loop on giving feedback is addressing what you need out of that situation, so that the other person knows how to make a correction, so that you're actually, telling them how to have a better relationship with you. Because I think the biggest thing about feedback, or one of the biggest things about giving feedback, is developing and communicating and maintaining boundaries. And so that way you're teaching people how to treat you.
And, Prita, when I think about this also, I look at, you made a very profound insight of statement there when you go, I have seen this, you have done this, or because you're saying I, so the person is sharing that they've personally experienced it or see it or want to address it. Question is that, when people have, is there a way, if you have not, and you want to provide the feedback to someone and you have not personally maybe seen it or experienced it, is there a certain way of credibility, not hearsay, to say, it has come to my attention, or it has, because I know sometimes that's a little bit of a hard situation if you haven't experienced it directly, but you think it's valuable enough that you want to share it with someone so they understand.
Yeah, in that situation, it's both the giving and receiving feedback. Because you haven't dealt with that situation firsthand, I
Right.
would think that the person giving the feedback would first have to do their due diligence and understanding uh, on the validity of that other information. And so, you want to try to, if it's a work environment, you definitely want to try to be as diplomatic as
Mhm.
possible and not, like, maybe disclose where it's coming from, as appropriate, and really try to understand, tell them what the situation is, how it's impacted the people around them, so that they're aware of it, and then try to understand where they were coming from when this happened, and really try to understand the situation. But then also, as they understand it, giving the appropriate feedback
Right.
that addresses the need of, if you're a leader, a people leader, understand the needs of their reports, and also the need of the, if this is another report, then understanding their needs and coming up with a good compromise.
Right. And like you said, especially in the work environment, if you're providing the feedback, usually, having specific examples that you can, go back to and say, that way someone understands, oh, yeah, okay, I understand now. I see, see how that might have been interpreted or so on. Curious though, I have to ask this, professional and so on. But what about in someone's personal life and you're trying to give feedback? Maybe it's to your parents, and they're, it's a tough, they're your parents. Are there tips and techniques to how to approach if it's a close loved one or a spouse or a partner or your best friend, that from a personal standpoint, stay away from doing this, or these are really good techniques to help, for those situations?
Yeah, another very important question. With the and those are different. There's a different way of people approach these different types of personal
Mhm.
situations, right? The way you handle your parents might be different than how you handle your spouse or friends and otherwise. But with your parents, it's especially difficult because they've really set that foundation and how you observe the world and your place in that world. Your mother traditionally provides your ability to teach yourself how to give self-respect and nurture and love for yourself and other people. And then your father typically traditionally is a character that provides your self-worth, your confidence, it really plays a role in how you act up in your career, your work life, and things. And then and so because of that, I guess almost like a survival need by your parents
Mhm.
that's been
Yeah.
created, it really creates a delicate situation, because a lot of times, we can also take our parents for granted. They'll always be my parents, but also the relationship of our parents, we might not realize, but unconsciously plays a role in these different emotional aspects of ourselves, our confidence and love, and things like that. And so, and then the hard part about it is that there's a lot of times. Uh, Transgenerational trauma. I know this is getting a little emotional, but sometimes the way that our parents are, is also, whether we like it or not, can impact the way we are as well. And so, like I was talking about before, becoming jaded. Like if we become jaded by our parents, like, oh, I never want to be like them again. And, like, I don't want to deal with them. Like they really screwed me up, or whatever the case is. It really actually it leads you to be more like them when you become that rebellious against them. It actually a lot of times leads you to be the same type of person. And then some people actually have a really healthy relationship with their parents, where they can give and take information and communication and things. But my recommendation is, again, to really develop, maintain, and communicate boundaries. And a lot of times in immigrant families, that becomes very difficult because there's a cultural barrier and a language barrier within the family itself, because our parents that immigrated here, or even if we immigrated here at a very young age, we have a different way of seeing the world and communicating the world than our parents might even. And so sometimes it makes it even difficult to really maintain boundaries, and communicate boundaries, because they're misunderstood. But I guess we can only do the best that we can do. And my recommendation in that environment is really, if your boundaries are impacted, you have to develop consequences, so that that if you maintain this type of boundary, and communication itself, verbal communication, is not working and you have to take different actions, then you have to be prepared for those consequences, and only you can know what those consequences are and be prepared for them. And then that, and with the spouse and our friend, it's somewhat similar in the sense of how you'll deal with that person again, versus a stranger you might not run into again, or even in like in a work environment, you might not see them in various different settings, but in a personal environment like your spouse or your friend, you might repeatedly see them. And so you also have to be a little diplomatic with that situation. But again, it'd be the same thing, like develop, communicate, and maintaining boundaries and understanding consequences.
Yes. Well, Prita, thank you so much for sharing all this great information with us. I really appreciate you being on the show. And I'd also like to thank our audience for watching. I hope you found some beneficial information on helping you give and receive feedback. Have a great day. I'm Cindy Kainz.